without the presentation. I can just talk. Yeah? All right. So, I'll move this up, and this is going to be a bit off the cuff since I had slides, and the slides are supposed to somewhat elucidate what I'm saying, but I'm going to give it a go anyway without the slides. I'll just use my speaker notes as some kind of guide to what I'm talking about here. So, talking about politics. First question, therefore, is what is politics? Politics is a really kind of nebulous word, and if you try to narrow it down, it's actually sometimes you get different answers from different people. Some people say politics, that's that thing that governments do. Yeah, but let me entertain for a moment the idea that politics is simply how groups of people come to decisions together. There are lots of different kinds of politics. So, government is one way to do politics. You can have a government essentially saying, okay, this we're going to dictate from on high. These are the rules. Everyone has to follow them. And maybe you've got something like a democratic process to elect your government. Maybe you don't. That's even worse. But also there are other kinds of politics. So school boards are politics. When you get together with your group of friends and say, we're going to go out to a party, how do we decide which party we're going to? That's politics. It's on a much smaller scale, much more local scale, but that's still politics. So politics is essentially this, how humans come together to decide on what they want to do. Interestingly, Bitcoin's consensus mechanism can therefore also be seen as a type of politics. I run my own node. I decide what my rules are. Yeah? Everyone would agree with that, I hope. But if I run my own node and I decide that my rules are so vastly different from everyone else's, I've decided that blocks can be unlimited size, like that shitcoin we won't talk about. Or I've decided that I'm going to produce new blocks with a much lower difficulty, or whatever the case is. Is your node going to accept transactions and blocks from my node? I would guess not. So, Bitcoin's consensus algorithm, Bitcoin's consensus mechanism, is a form of politics. It's not just a purely technical thing. It's human beings agreeing these are the things we're going to accept, these are the things we're not going to accept. So, politics extends into this fairly wide variety of different things, including Bitcoin consensus. Now, traditionally, when you think about politics, people often talk about the left and the right. Who here would consider themselves on the left? Okay, a couple, yep. Who here would consider themselves on the right? A few more. Who here doesn't consider themselves on the left or the right? Quite a lot more. Okay, cool. So I would put it to you that left and right is actually a fairly poor way to split up politics in general. It's not meaningless. There are some economic terms where we say, okay, the left tends towards these kinds of ideas, the right tends towards these kinds of ideas. But politics actually can also be split across other axes. So there's a really nice two-axis system called the political compass, where you describe both left and right, as well as authoritarian down to libertarian. So somebody could be authoritarian left, they could be authoritarian right, they could be libertarian left, they could be libertarian right. Some good examples of these kinds of things would be on the authoritarian left, in traditional historical things, you've got people like Stalin and Mao. On the authoritarian right, you've got basically every existing capitalist Western nation that exists. That includes so for those here from the US, that includes both the Republicans and the Democrats. They are both authoritarian right parties. That neither of those are a leftist party, not at all. They both occupy space in this top right corner, authoritarian right. At the libertarian left side of things, you've got classical anarchism. So if you read anything about anarchism from the 1800s, that kind of thing, you read people like Mikhail Bakunin or Proudhon, Joseph Proudhon, then those are traditionally libertarian left viewpoints. The libertarian right viewpoints tends to include people like anarcho-capitalists, so people who believe that you've got capital control over things, but want to be kind of left alone in every other way. So people unfamiliar with this kind of way of dividing things up between authoritarian and libertarian, as well as left and right, tend to assume that people on the other side of the political line from them, the left-right line, they assume that they are more libertarian and the other side is more authoritarian. So if you talk to most people who identify as on the left, they will say the right are authoritarians who want to take away our freedoms. And if you talk to people who identify on the libertarian right, they will say the left are these horrible authoritarians who want to take away our freedoms. But in reality, you're looking at the wrong spectrum. You're looking at this left-right and treating as if it's the up-down part of the spectrum. So most of Bitcoiners actually fit into almost everywhere across that spectrum. I'd say everywhere except the very top, the very authoritarian part. There's not a lot of ultra-authoritarians who are into Bitcoin. But there are even some moderately authoritarian people into Bitcoin. You look on Bitcoin Twitter, you will see a few monarchists, for example, and I'll never understand them, but okay, whatever. So right from the libertarian end through to a little bit into the authoritarian, and all the way from the left to the right. You have extreme left and extreme right in Bitcoin. You could be mistaken for thinking otherwise, though. If you look at Bitcoin Twitter, you've got this kind of group of very, very loud right-wing libertarian types who sometimes stray a little bit into some authoritarian views here and there. But I perceive myself very much in the lower left corner. I am libertarian left. So if you look at the back of my laptop, lots of Bitcoin stickers, but then end capitalism. Capitalism is unsustainable. I've got an Antifa flag there. Yeah, this is me. This is me. So those who want to run away now, feel free, but those who want to stick around, I might be able to explain some of it. So generally speaking, my political viewpoint is that of a classical anarchist or a free market anti-capitalist. Who in this room thinks that capitalism and free markets means the same thing? Okay, a couple of you. I'm here to tell you you're wrong, but don't worry, it's okay to be wrong. Traditionally, if you read books about capitalism, and especially about anti-capitalism, it's not arguing against free markets. So a free market anti-capitalist is not some kind of weird oxymoron. A free market anti-capitalist, such as myself, is somebody who believes that free markets are the best way to come to an understanding about the value of things, but that the system we call capitalism always leads to some kind of corruption and what you might call crony capitalism. That's an inevitable result of capitalist structures. So when I'm talking about capitalism, what I'm really talking about is control of society by those who have capital. The more money you have, the more control you have over things. And this is where it gets interesting. That's how the traditional money system works, and that's not how Bitcoin works. The traditional money system is one whereby those who sit closer to the money printer have more control, the Cantillon effect. Those who sit closer to them, those who have more capital, can make laws and change governments' minds and change the rules because they have more capital. That's the traditional money system. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is money by the people, of the people, for the people. Bitcoin is money where the means of distribution, production, and exchange is controlled by the people and not by any kind of centralized entity. I submit to you, Bitcoin is socialist. Bitcoin is a socialist system, a libertarian socialist system, not authoritarian. So what am I talking about? What's socialism then? Okay, socialism is the extreme left view, and that's what I hold, as well as being a libertarian. I hold this libertarian socialist position. Socialism is any system whereby the means of production, distribution, and exchange is controlled by the people as a whole. The reason it gets kind of a bad rap, especially in the Bitcoin space, is because you look at history and all you see is the authoritarian socialists. You see these governments who said, okay, if we're going to have the means of distribution, production, and exchange controlled by the people as a whole, well, how do we get the people as a whole to do it? Let's set up a government and give all that power to the government and say, that's on behalf of the people. Yeah, that's a load of bullshit. That's authoritarianism. So, you can have a libertarian socialist ideal whereby you simply remove authoritarian structures and still have things controlled by the people as a whole rather than centralized structures. So it's kind of interesting that in the space you often hear people talking about property rights. Property rights is something which is very misunderstood when, again, talking about socialism versus capitalism. So there's a socialist idea which makes a distinction between personal property and private property. If a socialist comes up to you and says, I want to abolish private property, he does not mean you're not allowed to own your laptop, your phone, your clothes, your house. What he means is that private property is something quite distinct from personal property. All of those things I mentioned are personal property, also known as real property. So, I have this phone in my pocket. I control it. I have the ability to do with it what I want. I have some Bitcoin private keys on here, and I have control over that Bitcoin. This is personal property. This is not something anyone can take away from me. However, private property, it tends to be legal fictions. So if I have an idea and I say, hey, I've got this really cool idea to do something, and I tell you about it, and then you take that idea and do something with it. In the current society, the current capitalist system we have, I could probably sue you for doing that because you violated my intellectual property rights. Yeah, the HDMI it doesn't seem to be working, but I'm talking without it, so it's fine. So sue you for violating you sue them for violating your intellectual property rights. But okay, what is intellectual property? It's just this legal fiction that we came up with to say, hey, there's this idea and we're somehow protecting it. Who's protecting it and how? Generally speaking, it's governments. So how does intellectual property exist if you don't want governments to exist? Pretty much doesn't. So these kinds of things are private property. Another example of private property is corporate personhood. So the idea that a company is a separate thing to the people who make it up. If you have a company, how should that company be, how should the people who are running the company somehow be protected from the actions that the company makes? That leads to psychopathy. The company is a psychopath because the company doesn't have human feelings, human desires, human wants. It's made up of people, but the company will do things that no person would do simply by giving it this idea of corporate personhood. So again, that's something which libertarian socialists in general, but especially libertarian socialists, want to abolish, the idea of a company being separate to the people who make it up. So that's essentially the idea of personal property versus private property, and I'd be happy to talk about that at length, but right now I won't. That leads me on to the concept of progressivism. So a lot of people hear the term progressive and they think of, okay, these horrible people who are, they've got funny coloured hair and they want drag queens to read to your kids in libraries, and that scares me. Yeah, no, progressivism, and I'm going to quote here from a really nice article by a guy called Tom Maxwell. Progressivism is the advancement of the human condition through social reform based on advancements in science, technology, economic development, and social organisation. So that's written by a guy called Tom Maxwell in an essay series called On Libertarian Socialism and Bitcoin. I highly recommend it. He's actually probably smarter on this topic than I am by far, but for some reason I always seem to get dragged into talking about this. And yeah, you can also listen to him on the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, and he's absolutely worth listening to. Maybe I'm getting some slides, or maybe not.
The resolution. Resolution, display resolutions.
Display resolution. Okay, one moment, everyone. Display settings. The Epson, it's gone now. Yeah. Display settings, Epson. It's shot. It's on default for display. You can stop mirroring.
No.
Yeah. No difference. It's okay. It's okay. I'll just continue without.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your help. It's okay. So, right. So, I've talked a bit about my politics and the fact that there are these different political views in the Bitcoin space. So, what I really want to kind of get across here is, there are people right across the political spectrum in Bitcoin. There are people on the left, there are people on the right. Most of us trend libertarian. Some go a little bit into authoritarian. Not me. How do we go out and actually reach more of these people? How do we go out and talk to more of these people? Well, generally speaking, if you are a Bitcoiner, roughly on the left of the spectrum, spread the word. Go out and talk to other Bitcoiners on the left, or go out to talk to other people on the left. Say Bitcoin is also for you. Bitcoin is for everyone. Bitcoin fits. Don't necessarily look at all of this stuff going on Twitter, or if you do, take it with a grain of salt and understand that Bitcoin is a much broader idea than perhaps you had imagined. If you are more on the right side of the political spectrum, well, first of all, you're wrong. No, sorry, I have to say that, but no. If you're more on the right, then understand that there are those of us in Bitcoin on the left. We are out there. The Bitcoin is not just this little bubble of right-wing libertarian viewpoints, and except that there are going to be different views, and if you want Bitcoin to be spread to the most possible people, then you also want Bitcoin to be available to people on the left, like myself. So there's a need for Bitcoin that also goes beyond political boundaries. So both the left and the right tend to agree that there are some significant problems in the world. Most of it comes down to money and access to money, and that's what Bitcoin solves. So if we look at a few problems, the global south tends to be relatively poor, largely because of economic controls put against them, either by their own governments or by the rest of the world. Bitcoin can help with that. Economic colonialism in Africa. You look at the Central African franc, controlled by France. France has the control of the monetary policy of several African nations. How does that make sense? Another group of people who really need Bitcoin is sex workers and other people in industries which are frowned upon by society. So, imagine somebody wants to, open a weed shop somewhere or sell naked pictures online or something like that, and the government comes along and says, yeah, no, you're not doing this. You don't get a bank account. You don't get access to PayPal, whatever the case may be. Bitcoin helps these people. And activists and protesters. There's a lot of different protests that have gone on around the world. Look at the Canadian truckers, for example, as a really well-known one in the Bitcoin space. But what about, Just Stop Oil, the guys throwing tomato soup on paintings at the moment? Do you think they could benefit from Bitcoin? I do. What about Extinction Rebellion? Do you think they could benefit from Bitcoin? I do. So whether you agree with them or not doesn't matter. These are people who have a message. These are people who want to be heard, and the governments are artificially limiting their ability to speak. Bitcoin fixes this. Now, it's not a silver bullet. There are still issues. Until we have Bitcoin circular economies, we have problems with things like, activist gets Bitcoin from supporters or whatever. What does he do with it? What does the activist do with this Bitcoin? Right now, most of the time, he has to change it back to fiat in some way, and maybe those fiat on-ramps are going to be blocked. So what do we as Bitcoiners need to do? We need to encourage the Bitcoin circular economy. We need to encourage the ability for people to transact with Bitcoin even into fiat in more private ways, so avoiding regulation, avoiding centralized government controls. And we need to accept that this is covering everyone from the far right through to the far left, and everyone in between. What about if we don't do anything? What if we just say, it's okay, it'll sort itself out. Bitcoin's awesome and it sorts itself out and there's no problems, so let's just leave it. Let's not talk about improving things for everyone. Well, if we don't do that, I actually think Bitcoin does have a small, not non-existent, but still very small, risk of becoming irrelevant largely through speculation. So people speculate at the moment on Bitcoin. They speculate on shitcoins. They speculate on pretty much everything. Where does Bitcoin have a unique advantage when it comes to speculation? It actually really doesn't. Bitcoin's main advantage over, for example, Litecoin is that it's got far more proof of work behind it. It's far more secure. But technically the code base between Bitcoin and Litecoin is pretty damn close, though they're almost the same thing. Bitcoin's advantage there is proof of work behind it. If it's a speculative asset, who cares? Bitcoin's security is based in its proof of work, and Bitcoin's security is what makes it censorship-resistant, strong, good, hard money. If we don't use it as censorship-resistant, strong, hard, good money, then we don't have a good reason for Bitcoin to actually succeed over any of these other shitcoins, sadly. So let's use it. There's some great groups out there doing it. I'd just like to shout out a couple just by name. This is 4 out of hundreds, but Mi Primer Bitcoin here in El Salvador doing educational stuff I think is amazing. Bitcoin for Fairness, Bitcoin Akasi, Built with Bitcoin Foundation, Bitcoin Jungle sitting over there. These are people doing things with Bitcoin. These are people who actually understand Bitcoin as censorship-resistant hard money, which is good for humanity. And we need to move away from the speculation more towards that. So that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about. What I'd like to just say is, Bitcoin needs you to take action, and at the very least, that minimum action is understanding that Bitcoin is for everyone, understanding that there are these different political views, and not just immediately shutting down anyone who is different than you in some way. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions. Like I said, by the way, I did have slides to go along with that, and some of them are quite funny, like a wonderful little picture of a Molotov cocktail dressed up with a rainbow coming out of it saying, "Eat the rich." You need this kind of thing, but yeah, sorry to say, couldn't present today. But yeah, I hope that was good for everyone. Thank you.